Hello, everyone. Welcome to this webinar on investing in nascent climate technologies. We are thrilled to have you with us for what is going to be, we're sure, a very engaging discussion on the sorts of technologies that can mitigate climate change and reduce emissions. My name is Ben Soltoff. I am an Environmental Innovation Fellow with the Sci Center for Innovative Thinking at Yale and the Center for Business and the Environment at Yale. And I'm really thrilled to welcome you to this event here today. This is an event that has several co-sponsors. There's centers at Yale, Sci-City, and CBay. There's Yale alumni groups, Accelerate Yale, which focuses on startups and entrepreneurship. Yale Blue-Green, which focuses on sustainability. We're also jointly hosting this with a couple Stanford alumni groups, Stanford Startups New York, as well as the Stanford Alumni Group of New York City. And another group that's part of the planning and co-sponsoring of this event is Young Professionals in Energy, New York City, which is a network of young professionals in New York City that develops leadership panels and networking events like this one, and regularly holds events in the tri-state area with 3,500 members. You can join them at ypeenergy.org, New York City, or email them at ny@ypeenergy.org. So I just listed off a really wide set of groups and set of partners. And the reason that we have so many partners for this event is that, as we were at CBay talking about doing an event on nascent climate technologies, part of which was to share some research that we've done on insights and considerations for investors, we found more and more people who are interested in similar topics, people who are willing to speak about those topics, and people who are willing to push out events to their network to get a wider set of folks in the conversation. And the reason for that is that this is something a lot of people have been thinking about recently as climate change has entered onto the public consciousness. There's many solutions to climate change that are already out there, that are already functioning and able to be implemented and just need the right policies and will to make them happen. But there's also a number of solutions that are still being developed and still being implemented. And those are a really important piece of the puzzle. And there's a lot of work to be done in getting those out there, including directing more finance and funding to those different solutions. So just as we tee up this conversation on investing in nascent climate technologies, I want to do a little bit of definition of what nascent climate technologies are. This is a chart that originally came from a report called The Investment Gap That Threatens the Planet in the Stanford Social Innovation Review. And it kind of defines what the different areas of technology are, as well as the sorts of investors who invest in those technologies. So there's the unexplored solution spaces, which are solutions that are still kind of very early, haven't been proven technologically. Nascent solutions, which have been proven technologically, but haven't been proven commercially and economically. So they're on that road across the valley of death to commercialization or close to commercialization. And then there's commercialization where there are ideas that are close to being able to raise revenue and have customers. And so you can see some of the different investors there. We're going to ask our panelists as they introduce themselves to kind of place themselves along this spectrum. But we wanted to show you this image as we got started to kind of give you some context on what exactly it is that we're talking about. If you want more information on this topic, CBay has just put out a report on investing in nascent climate technologies called From Solutions to Scale. And I will put that in the chat if anyone wants to take a look at that. It just came out today. And it's a great additional resource. But speaking of resources, we have some really wonderful resources in terms of the people on this panel who are presenting. And so I'm going to turn it over to them to lay out some of these issues, starting with Richard Kaufman. Richard Kaufman is the chair of Generate Capital, which is a leading financer and owner of clean energy infrastructure. He's also a chair of the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority, NYSERDA. He's an adjunct research scholar at Columbia, as well as a professor at Yale. Prior to these positions, he was in the office of Andrew Cuomo as the chair of energy and finance for the state of New York, or as he was known more informally, the energy czar. So we are thrilled to have a czar here with us to talk about energy and investing in nascent climate technologies. And with that, I will turn it over to Richard to deliver some opening remarks.
Thank you, Ben. I hope it works out better for this czar than the prior czars. I want to thank the Yale and Stanford sponsors, and Ben, I want to congratulate you on your report that's just come out. So what I'd like to do is talk about some structural obstacles and also some evolution in government policy. And out of the obstacles and some of the evolution in government policy, at least at the state, I'm going to also, I think, hopefully lay the stage for some opportunity. So we've all seen this kind of wind turbine before, but it turns out that a three-bladed wind turbine may not be the best technology. That in fact, a two-bladed wind turbine would be better. It would obviously be lighter, it'd be easier to manufacture, it has less material, and less wear and tear. So the question is, why do we have three-bladed wind turbines and as opposed to two? And there are a couple answers. One is that a two-bladed wind turbine spins very fast and can make a lot of noise. And the second is aesthetically, a two-bladed wind turbine is disturbing to some people because it looks like it would stop for a second at 12 and 6. So when we look at offshore wind turbines, you can see that they've essentially had the same three-bladed design, which have been adapted to offshore. So the question would be, well, if you're talking about something that's far offshore, noise isn't a factor and the aesthetics aren't a factor. So maybe what we should do is be in the business of developing a nascent climate solution technology, which would be a two-bladed offshore wind turbine. And there are some people, in fact, that are working on this. So what would be the various steps needed to take this idea to reality? And Ben just talked upon some of that, which is the basic lifestyle of a venture where you have an idea and it starts and it has different stages of development. From, if we were going to be in the wind turbine manufacturing business, you have to come up with the design, engineering prototypes, production, and eventual deployment. And all along the way, your cash flow is negative. And all along the way, also, there are different places you'd need to stop to get financing. And of course, that's what people call the valley of death, the long period of negative cash flow. So there are lots of people, lots of designs of different kinds of wind turbines, and yet we still see the three-bladed wind turbine. So, so what makes investing in nascent climate technologies challenging? Well, many markets are mature, served by entrenched competitors. Markets aren't valuing externalities. Sustainable solutions require large sums of capital, and businesses often rely upon government policy. But I think what else makes investing in nascent climate technologies challenging is this issue of companies needing to access many silos of financing along the way, and that these silos were built for financing not nascent climate technologies, but for other sectors of the economy. And so what nascent climate technology companies have to do is they need to fit into these financing silos that were designed for another purpose. And these silos are often ill-suited to the timescale and risks associated with the opportunity. And there are lots of examples, so I'm just going to tick through a few. Well, the traditional venture capital business model is inconsistent with capital-intensive, long-dated investments. I don't think I need to elaborate on that, but if you've got a fund with a limited life, it's just really hard to invest in things that are capital-intensive. Growth investors, and there are lots of growth investors in the economy. A really good example are growth investors that invest in biotech. Biotech has no difficulty generally raising capital. So why is it that biotech companies are able to get through this valley of death? Well, that's because the investors in biotech companies know at the end of the day if the drug works, there'll be a market. But the challenge that we have in the nascent climate technology area is that we're asking growth investors to take not only technology risk, but market risk, and they are unwilling to take both those kind of risks. Another example of the challenge of these silos is that deployments of climate technologies often will require non-recourse financing. So developed by independent developers or solutions as a service. And these represent a challenge to traditional project finance structures, particularly if they're small, they have new innovative technology. Infrastructure funds, they were set up often to invest in things like ports and other kinds of infrastructure that have meaningful construction risk. So the charters of most infrastructure funds prohibit investments in infrastructure that have development and construction risk. And so many of the nascent energy technologies, don't involve that same kind of large-scale construction or development risk. And finally, the rest of the economy uses stocks and bond markets. That offers the lowest cost and transparency. But these are not widely available. And some of that is in the case of law, like no MLPs for a renewable energy company. Sometimes you require size in order to be able to access the bond market, or lack of data that's needed in order to get credit ratings. So those are some of the financing related obstacles. I want to just quickly talk about sort of government policy and how government policy, at least at some states, has begun to change. And I think also amongst some people that are thinking about the federal government as well. So the old view was, the costs of climate change solutions, they're too high. So what we need to do is we need to invest in innovation. And then once costs come down, then we're going to deploy. And so what we're going to do is we're going to fund demonstration projects, first of a kind projects. And then what we're going to do is we're going to spend a lot of time fretting how we're going to finance these companies through the valley of death. And should we have a clean energy deployment entity or something, a federal government solution to to solve this financing gap? So I actually think that there's an increasing awareness that there's a connection between markets, innovation, scale, and costs. And so an innovation-only investment is not really going to achieve the objective. That funding a single project can build a pier, but it's not going to build a bridge. It's not going to get to a sustainable market. And it's just not possible that an inventor is going to be able to come up with a widget that's going to overcome the benefits of scale, which is what many conventional technologies already have. And so there's also a greater emphasis on getting more leverage on public dollars. And so it's ironic because we have evidence from Moore's law about the relationship between innovation, scale, and costs. And so Moore's law, which we all have heard of, it's about the performance and cost characteristics of chips. That's not a law of physics. That's a law of markets. And so with increasing economic prize draws in ever more innovation. And we've certainly seen this back to the point about offshore wind turbines and wind turbines generally. As Europe developed the offshore wind industry or the domestic wind industry, it created a bigger and bigger economic prize. It drew in more and more companies that were interested in exploiting that prize and knew how to make bigger and bigger things. So this is a 7 megawatt wind turbine. The current ones are 8, and they're 10 or more on the drawing board, and they're really large. And that's what's accounted for this huge price decline in wind. So states, again, in terms of public dollars, it was great to fund one project at a time. But states increasingly realize that they're not going to have a big influence on the cost of panels. And when you fund a single project, some of that is funding the hardware as well as the soft costs. And soft costs are, greater in residential solar than the module costs. And so that's why things like solarizing is a very efficient way to lower customer acquisition costs, which is one of the large soft costs, and a good leverage on public dollars. So now going back to offshore wind, we now have a very large market that's been established, that's being held up for the moment by the federal government, but a very large market that seems to have come out of nowhere with offshore wind in the East. And so how did this happen so quickly? So first was to establish a large end market opportunity within New York State, and then to encourage friendly competition with other states. It's the same point. If you create a large economic prize, you're going to draw in investment from the industry. And so you can see now that there's already, it's now really already almost a 30 megawatt market that's been established with the other states. The other thing was to accelerate the time of development by site identification with the federal government. And these are just about reducing development costs, and also reducing development costs by performing a whole range of studies and engaging the community, and also by mobilizing the supply chain. So you have a bunch of European companies that are bidding for contracts. They need to procure lots of stuff here. And so the state spent time and effort to mobilize and integrate the supply chain so that the bidders for the offshore wind projects were able to have a line of sight all the way through. And so this is all the kind of stuff that was in the master plan. So the cost, as it turned out, when you do all this stuff, it turned out to be 40% less than the projection that NYSERDA did in 2018 in terms of the bidding. So it shows that creating scale and doing all this stuff can significantly reduce costs. So we can imagine, people are talking about carbon to value, capturing CO2 and doing stuff with it, not just bury it in the ground, but turn it into building materials. You could imagine the same kind of thing. You could establish a roadmap on the relationship between deployment and expected costs, then establish an end market, clean concrete standard, a clean hydrogen standard, clean fuel standard are examples where you get started. You could imagine government aggregating corporate demand to, again, lower customer acquisition costs, animating supply chain, and then to the degree to which projects need to be developed by independent developers, provide some initial project debt financing through the Green Bank. So what does this all mean in terms of opportunities? Well, it means for investors, and you see this beginning to happen, is there's the opportunity in investing across adjacent silos, because that's where the opportunities, there are going to be opportunities that arise being able to operate in between these silos. And for governments and philanthropists, it's really filling in across these different silos of activities. It's not just innovation versus deployment. It's trying to figure out all the steps along the way. And that's one of the great things about the paper that's just been released, because we need efforts by governments and philanthropists to align the different steps along the food chain. The food chain is probably the bad example because animals eat each other, but along this whole chain of activity. And so philanthropists and governments can do these other things in terms of helping to support research and early stage grants and so forth. But governments alone, I think, can really be the entities that do market development. So if you do all these things, government does, and philanthropists do what I've just described, and investors invest in adjacent silos, we can wind up shortening the valley of death. So just finally, some thoughts on COVID-19. I think there's obviously a strain on state government finances because states really support, or at least a lot of clean energy support. And so they're going to be strain on government finances and utility bills that fund it versus obviously the need for recovery. We don't know what the federal green stimulus is going to be. I think one of the things that's an obvious point, but it certainly shows that governments, markets, and behavior can change quickly in the event of a crisis, which is a positive part. Another thought is just that inflation is very harmful to projects with long dated revenue because high interest rates means that those out year revenues are worth less. And I think it's pretty clear that investors are going to be cautious about investing in new deals and among LPs for new commitments. So with that, I'll stop. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard, for those opening remarks. It's great to lay out what we're talking about here and to give some additional context. Before we go to our next set of opening remarks, I do want to lay out for everyone what our agenda is today. I neglected to do that earlier. We're going to start with opening remarks like you just heard from Richard. We'll have some more remarks from Jigger Shah. We'll then have more of a moderated panel. So we do want to kind of start out by laying out some ideas about how things have gone in the past, where they're going in the future, but we're going to create a more dynamic discussion between the multiple perspectives that we have here for you all in the latter part of this event. So with that in mind, I want to go to our second set of opening remarks, which are coming from Jigger Shah. He's the president and co-founder of Generate. Prior to co-founding Generate, Jigger pioneered No Money Down Solar as the founder and chief executive of SunEdison, unlocking a multi-billion-dollar solar market and making SunEdison the largest solar services company worldwide before it was acquired. After SunEdison, Jigger served as the founding CEO of Carbon War Room, which was a global nonprofit founded by Sir Richard Branson and Virgin Unite to help entrepreneurs address climate change. He's the author of several books and articles, and we're thrilled to have him with us here today. So I will turn it over now to Jigger to give some more opening remarks. And Jigger, just make sure you unmute yourself before.
There you go. Thanks, Ben. I wasn't going to use any slides, but Richard's were so compelling, I figured I'd show a couple on my own. I think that one of the challenges with wrapping your brain around this is that I think there's a underlying impression that if we fix this challenge around the Valley of Death and the nascent technology side of things, that we're more likely to solve climate change. And I think it's important for folks to recognize that we have a lot of examples where that just simply isn't true. And I think it's important to notice where that isn't true and why it isn't true, and maybe just to sort of see how we sort of we resolve the tension between those topics. Because what ends up happening is that I think all of us are feeling like this is the moment, right? We need to really solve things. We got this COVID crisis, we have a looming climate crisis, and if we can all just solve this issue, then we'll feel a lot better about the work that we've done over time. What I'd say is that I think that the solar and wind space more broadly really unlocked something that frankly had been locked for a long time. The project finance industry in the United States had really been shut down since the Reagan tax bill of 1986. And it really opened back up, in the early 2000s with SunEdison and lots of other folks. So today you actually have a vibrant project finance market with residential solar, commercial solar, utility scale. You've got mostly just utility scale wind. But when you start to look at the next phase of projects, we in general have this feeling that, for instance, Bloom Energy, publicly traded company, very successful. Is it really on track to reaching multi-billion-dollar scale? Maybe, but it's not quite there yet. And we don't really have a clear understanding of who's supposed to help them get there. The same thing's true for, another publicly traded company, let's call it Plug Power, other, companies that are in the compost business, other folks that are in the anaerobic digester business. These are technologies where you have, 1,800 operating digesters in Germany and Italy that haven't really broached the 100-unit mark here in the United States. And so part of what we need to think about is when we think about, let's say, the biotech industry, which I think folks herald as a well-functioning market, is that once companies reach a certain validation of their technology, validation of their approach, there's a payoff there. And in our sector, there really isn't one. largely because there's a lot of incumbent technologies that provide electricity, energy, water, food, land, materials, as I show in the slide. And there's a lot of incumbents there that don't really have an incentive to do something that is cheaper, better than what's already there. Part of this also goes to the variety of different types of capital sources. I think there's a lot of folks here that, obsessed by government grants, R&D, venture capital, private equity, as shown in the report. But there's many more than that, right? Things like, project equity, construction financing, senior debt, development loans, inventory finance. And all of these things work together in tandem, I think, to really unlock nascent technologies. The last set of slides I want to talk through is really just more about how capital markets think through this stuff. So in general, people think about risk return, right? So you think about venture capital, you're taking a lot of risk, you need a lot of return. You can, be happy with 8 different, investments going bad if 1 or 2 of them are home runs. I think the part that we don't really think through is the work component, right? It's not just risk and return, it's also work. When you think about, for instance, some of the toughest, gnarliest problems that we have, this summer, we're very concerned about rolling blackouts in New York City, right? Largely because people are at home, right? A lot of commercial industrial loads are down. A lot of residential loads are up. If people are sheltering in place in their homes, air conditioning might be through the roof. They might actually keep it on all day. And some of the circuits that people are, getting their power from are not built for every one of those people to be living there, not working, being in their home with the air conditioning on. And so, the question becomes, is it a technology problem? Is it a nascent technology problem that it's not working? Or is it really, sort of a deployment problem around work? In this particular case with BQDM, which was a big initiative that was done by the state of New York and, under the REV process, it was around, there are a lot of low, medium income folks who live there, right? And how do you go into those homes when they're paying $5 or $10 a month in New York public housing for air conditioning? The electricity is free. It's part of their rent. How do you get that done, right? These are all nascent technologies that have come out of labs that have been funded by people. But the challenge is that the actual work to get the technology in the field and to prove to Con Ed that it would be there to solve the problem of blackouts is a really challenging problem. And where do you get the money from? Is it venture capitalists that give you money to figure out whether you can talk to customers, or is it NYSERDA that's supposed to give you a grant to do that? Like where is the money supposed to come from to really solve that problem, to prove that you can use, let's say, in this case, DERs, demand response and load control, to solve these, gnarly issues that clearly all stakeholders want to solve. And so a lot of what we find is that, in fact, the challenge here really is that there's this, really large hole in steps 2, 3, and 4. I think the paper that Ben shared was really around demonstrating the technology, and then you've got deployment. What I'd say, there's actually 3 steps in the middle there. And so step 1 is really demonstration, but step 2 is really getting the first, like sort of the second plant, 3rd plant, 4th plant, 5th plant, 10th plant installed. Then you've got the hockey stick, right? How do you support folks who frankly aren't using $100 million? They need $25 million. Part of our challenge is we're just too good, right? Like we've miniaturized everything, right? When people say that your cell phone is more powerful than all the computers that put the man on the moon, they're right. And, in general, now you can actually install a whole bunch of $50,000 installations instead of one $200 million installation. And there's a lot of people set up to provide $200 million of capital. There's not a lot of people set up to provide $200 million of capital in $50,000 increments before you can prove you can get to $200 million of capital. And then the other challenge of this is cost of capital, right? One of the big challenges with the New York Green Bank, setup and the other Green Bank setups that we've thought about around the country is there's been this fight between lower interest rates and, capital markets. New York Green Bank really said, no, we're going to charge market-based, interest rates, and we're really going to figure out how to provide liquidity to the market, not subsidize. Connecticut started, with a lower interest rate, and they've moved more to market rate. But what you find is there's this, cycle of solutions where what you really want to do is to figure out how to lower costs, increase available market share, decrease risk, and then, figure out a way to make these technologies ultimately bankable. And the bankability piece is hard to come by. There are publicly traded companies that currently don't have technologies that are bankable. And I think it's critical to figure out what that means, because this is the difference between going from millions to billions. I think for a lot of us, we focus on going from 0 to millions, but then in fact, millions to billions is still nascent, right? When you think about it, billions of dollars of deployment of infrastructure in this country can still put you at a market share that's less than 0.2%, right? You're not really solving the problem. You're really, on your way to solving the problem. And so those are some of the thoughts that I would start you guys with, which is that when you think about all the stakeholders in the process, from government to elected officials, right? We're going into this post-COVID crisis, as Richard talked about, and green stimulus is on people's minds. I got a call from a mayor the other day who said, "Hey, I've got a $50 million pile of capital. What should I do to get nascent technologies rolled out?" I was like, "What are you talking about? We have 500,000 people that have lost their jobs in the energy efficiency sector that we need to put to work. Like, I love nascent technologies, but where's your mandate?" Right? And I think that when you think about how policy interacts with government, interacts with these research and development agencies, interacts with incubators and all these other pieces, I'd say that in general, we tend to not have this ambitious agenda in front of us. In general, I think we feel like if we can just help these guys through this one part of the valley of death, if we can get them past, this government funding, we get them some venture capital, they get proof of concept, minimum viable product, we've done our job. And what I'd say is that, in fact, even after technologies are no longer labeled nascent in this, report that came out, they still are likely to fail. They're still likely to they're still likely not to succeed. They're still likely not to get acquired by a large acquirer, right? These issues continue to be, very difficult. And figuring out how we actually work across the spectrum to make sure that technologies that are already through this nascent phase are going to be successful means that you'll have a lot more enthusiasm from investors into nascent technologies, right? If the winners of in their portfolio are not actually financial winners, then you can imagine their enthusiasm to go back into nascent technologies is dampened. And so I'd encourage everyone on the panel to think through the definition of nascent, not just from the technology side of things, but how, utilities view technologies and what they define as nascent, or government officials and what they define as nascent, because all of these are linked together.
Thank you, Jigger. Thank you
Thanks,
for those remarks, and thank you for continuing to tee up this subject we're talking about, and also to challenge us a little bit on how we defined it and what really fits into that box in terms of nascent solutions and what's needed, particularly in the current context. I think that spirit of questioning is really helpful, and I think that that's something that I would like to encourage you all on the panel to continue as we move into more of the conversation portion of our event, which will be moderated by Namrita Kapoor, who is an adjunct lecturer and executive fellow at the Yale School of Management, and also a fellow at the Yale Center for Business and Environment, CBA. Before her roles at Yale, and also somewhat concurrently, she was a senior portfolio and network officer at Grow Old Family Fund, where she managed grantees on business planning and strategy development, and while helping the executive director in scaling Grow Old Family Fund's efforts to convene and bridge funders to catalytic NGOs. Before that, she worked for the Environmental Defense Fund, doing strategy development and on initiatives in climate, energy, and ecosystems. And prior to that, she was on the founding team and second in command at Root Capital. So she's someone who brings a wide set of experience across NGOs, philanthropy, and investment. So we're thrilled to have her both with us at Yale, as well as the moderator for this particular event. So with that introduction, I'm going to turn it over to Namrita to move us into the discussion portion of the event, as well as introduce some of our additional panelists.
Great, thank you, Ben. And thank you for putting together this webinar. As we can see from the opening remarks, it's already proven to be a very interesting conversation. Just to sort of underline some of the points that I was hearing brought out, Richard focused a lot on the fact that it's not just about innovation, but also about deployment. And it should be a yes and rather than an either or. And Jigger very much picked up on that and talking about some of the how important that sort of more mature technologies have to be successful if we're going to attract capital to that early part of the innovation spectrum. And sort of circling back to where we started about working across silos. Both Richard and Jigger touched upon how important it is to work across silos. So I'm thrilled that our panelists represent perspectives from across that full spectrum of capital. I'm going to ask each of them to introduce themselves and touch upon where they fit in that spectrum of capital. And also I've asked them to touch upon both the sort of opportunity of our time and challenge regarding this investing. With the price of oil being at an all-time low, many people are concerned about the opportunities for some of these more climate smart technologies. But at the same time, there's a lot of hope around part of the recovery being a green recovery. So with that, I'm going to start with Connor Prohaska. So Connor, if you can touch upon where you sit in the spectrum of capital, and also are you glass half full or glass half empty or someplace in between, and why?
Sure. Thank you very much for having me, and happy to be here. My name is Connor Prohaska, and I'm the Chief Commercialization Officer for the Department of Energy. And in that role, I'm also the Director of the Office of Technology Transitions for the department. Prior to that, I was Chief of Staff and Senior Advisor at ARPA-E. And prior to that, a life as a lawyer in the private world. I think there's two sides of that. One is a very real concern right now of being in the federal government and where we are going through the COVID crisis. I would tell you, coming into it, we had a very clear mandate from Congress and the White House that they wanted us to not just take care of our 17 national labs and the technology that we fund and research that we fund through those labs, but also to pay attention to the regional innovation energy ecosystems and how we can support that and how we can create more handoffs as technology matures. Frankly, now as we sit here, I want to make sure that those things that have been built over, I'd say, the past decade don't lose too much ground during this time. This is a very, very hard time for a lot of those incubators, for a lot of those cutting edge organizations, some of which had their business model based around community co-working spaces, which are probably not going to be as successful going forward. So paying attention to how we can be a voice for those incubators, the ecosystems, and all that kind of has been built around this technology area of developing new energy technologies over the past decade. That is really right now what I'm most concerned about, is making sure that on the other side of this, that we can supply the resources. We talk about whatever the next relief package is going to look like. Tough to hang our hats on that yet, because right now it's just talk. There's nothing really necessarily concrete that has been raised. But we're working to make sure that we're paying attention to that and that we are helping to be a voice in that innovation ecosystem so that we can support, to go to your first question, of where we are, which is the very early, before we even say nascent, right? The very early stage of research for the Department of Energy and our $18 billion worth of research that we spend every year. We want to make sure there's somebody to hand that to. And so very motivated about the ecosystem itself and the people that are committed to this. But, you know, Jigger kind of hit on it there, which is there's a lot of people that are out of work in this sector. And that's got to be a primary concern. We all want to think about what's next, and we should, and that's appropriate. But right now, we need to pay attention to the people that are hurting during this particular crisis and issues. So that's where I stand right now, kind of in what we're thinking about in the Office of Technology Transitions and at the Department of Energy when it comes to new and innovative technology across the country.
Great, thanks. And moving to Johanna Wolfson.
Hi, yeah, thanks for having me. It's good to be on with so many great folks. I am here representing Prime Impact Fund, which is an initiative out of Prime Coalition. My co-founder of the fund, we are just about to conduct our final close, and Prime Impact Fund sits at this really interesting intersection, really between what you would see coming out of the DOE National Labs or other very early government support and other types of venture capital. So we're able to do that because we leverage philanthropic funding. We often call it catalytic funding. Capital that has as its primary purpose a social good rather than as its primary purpose a financial return. That doesn't mean it's necessarily concessionary capital. It's just capital that sort of has a different priority stack, if you will. And what we've done with Prime Impact Fund is built a $50 million seed and Series A stage fund that is able to invest in companies at a pretty nascent stage. And so what do I mean by that? Typically, these are companies that haven't yet seen institutional capital. They may have angel investors, but typically not yet institutional capital. And we're often, not always, first money in, or we're syndicating to help a company get together its first round. And, you know, companies in this position, we're generally looking for where we can have the most additive impact. So it's important to us that we're supporting companies that are unlikely to otherwise get funded, but we always want that to be for good reasons, not for bad reasons. What do I mean by that? We're looking to support companies that really just have specific things to be de-risked before they will be attractive to follow-on funders. And then we can be the source of that de-risking capital. We're not looking to fund companies that even if we put in capital, you know, they don't have that pathway to follow on. And so a lot of our investment process is about walking that line and figuring out the companies that really have a shot to become scaled growth companies, but don't yet have the proof points or the market case fully mapped out, and we can be part of that. I want to also mention, because it's relevant to some of the opening remarks from Richard and from Jigger, and I know folks on our team have gone to both of those individuals for feedback on this, but we're really actively thinking at Prime about other valleys of death, as it were. So we've been excited to focus our early years on how catalytic and philanthropic capital can serve as in this gap for truly nascent technologies. But really, this idea of catalytic capital that can take on unique types of risk is very powerful and can be probably used in interesting ways in project finance and to de-risk first-of-a-kind plants and so on. And so we're very actively thinking about how to do that and just more fully characterizing that capital gap and the attributes of philanthropic capital that could, in certain cases, make a difference there. So just wanted to mention that as a connecting thread. In terms of, glass half empty, glass half full, this is a really tough time, and I don't have as many optimistic things to say as I would like. We are just very focused, on the one hand, on helping our portfolio companies get through this time and navigate some difficult decisions. And on the other hand, recognizing that this will be a challenging fundraising environment for our own portfolio companies, as well as other companies that are coming up for the first time for funding that may not have prior investors to double down. It makes us think that our mission is as important as ever, where we are able to bring capital that is purpose built to be long term and risk embracing. So we're in a fortunate position in that we're just conducting our final close of the fund right now. So we have a lot of dry powder. We're able to keep going. We've made 2 investments in the last month. So for us it's full steam ahead, but with an awareness that that this will probably be a challenging environment for companies for some time. And that means for us, we're going to probably syndicate even more than we have, stretch our dollars further and so on. But for us, we're not pulling back at all in terms of, looking to make new investments or the like.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So half empty, yet it sounds like there might be an effort to sort of bridge silos a little bit more and focus on sort of syndication. So could be an opportunity in some ways, building new partnerships. So now moving further along the spectrum to Priscilla Tyler at True Ventures.
Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you all. Thanks to the other panelists. And congrats, Jana, on the final close. That is super exciting. So I'm an investor over at True Ventures, which is a seed stage venture capital firm based in San Francisco. We typically tend to lead the seed rounds with checks of $1 to $3 million on average. We invest across all sectors and all geographies, so we're spread pretty wide. We're pretty generalist as a whole, which provides quite a different perspective, I think, than some of the other panelists, which I hope will be useful to some of you. So I came to True from via the East Coast, where I studied at Amherst College. Some of my personal, I think to your question, Amrita, about the glass half full, glass half empty, I look at it from kind of both a personal perspective and a work perspective. And while some of my time was spent in college studying environmental science, I think my journey into this sector has actually more been formed from a personal part of my life, which is my partner's job. He's actually a forest firefighter and has been fighting some of these quite large fires over the past few years. So it's been quite an interesting and intense way to kind of come to terms with how far we have to go to heal our planet. But it's also been probably one of the most inspirational ways I can think of to merge into this field in terms of investing in it. So that's kind of the personal way that I look at it in terms of glass half full, because I see how far we have to go, and I also see how much energy others have around it. And then from a work perspective, kind of have to be an optimist in this field from an early stage venture capital perspective, in my opinion. I tend to look at when others run away and get a little frightened about spending time in a space and deploying capital, I tend to run towards it because it means opportunity in my perspective. And I've seen a lot of it's gone in waves, I think, over the past year of traditional venture getting more and more involved in the space, but I think there still remains a lot of fear and trepidation. But again, that kind of inspires and fires me up. So I definitely look at it from a glass half full perspective in a little bit of a different way, maybe a little naive, but more optimistic in my opinion.
I'm glad to hear it. We'll want to circle back about some of the opportunities you run towards that others are running away from. And then moving to wrapping up our 4 panelist introductions, Jake at DBL Partners.
Yeah, thank you again for the opportunity to be here. So I'm an investor at DBL Partners. We're a venture capital fund, primarily investing at that Series A, Series B stage, sometimes going a little bit earlier and sometimes a little bit later. And I'm also an alum of SOM and specifically took Richard's class. And so recognize some of those slides and teachings from the opening presentation here. And so getting to this question of kind of glass half full versus half empty, and I think the sort of overlay to a lot of this conversation is this idea that's been surfacing over the last year or so around climate tech. And so I'll give a little bit of the pessimistic half empty case at first, which, being at a fund and really joining a partnership that's been looking at this space for 16 years, you could see climate tech as a rebranding of, a sector that's been truly maturing. It was called clean tech for a while and then green tech. Some people called it sustainability investing. I'm sure, Jigger and Richard could both speak at length to, a set of activities and work that's been done in the sector for a long time. And within the venture asset class, there was a period in the mid 2000s where the tourists kind of came to the island and then they ran away. and that, you could see sort of this set of activity over the last year, just kind of the new buzzword of today, which then got wiped out even harder, once COVID hit. So I think that's the, a pessimistic view with some honesty, but I don't think that takes away from the fundamental principle, which is, really why we should be glass half full. And I think as you look forward over the next sort of multi-decade period here, there's this opportunity to unhinge from carbon that touches every sector of our global ecosystem. And there are massive opportunities. I think Jigger alluded to this, but as you look at global energy markets today, they're about worth $6 trillion. They're poised to grow by as much as 48% over the next 30 years. You look at sort of major problems that we have to solve of, there's 800 million people that still live without access to reliable electricity throughout the globe. And there's other sectors too, outside of sort of pure energy. If you look at food and agriculture, within about 20 years, we're going to have 10 billion mouths to feed. And there's going to be more food consumption than over the entire course of human history. And caloric intakes can go up about 70%. So that sort of introduces a whole set of opportunity as it relates to innovation. And when you talk about these sort of incumbent industries, there is a true opportunity here that is on par with anything, I think we've seen in technology or the life sciences. But going back to sort of my opening point, it just has to be grounded in a realism of knowing that it takes very hard work. It's, multi-year period. There are networks to develop. There are, a knowledge set and tools to be able to really have the commitment to this. And there is a breadth and a depth that I think is probably represented on the participants around this call, as well as the panelists, to really be able to realize that opportunity. So that's my, I'll say, on the fence of between half full and half empty.
High market opportunity if we can figure it out. So, so optimistic, but yes, there's acknowledging the challenges. So going back across all of you, and we don't necessarily have to go in the order that you started, I'm interested in hearing about staying on the, I guess, pessimistic side for a moment, but never let a crisis go to waste sort of theme. Share a failure from your experience investing in climate tech, and what have you learned from it? What are you doing differently now that you've experienced that failure? Because usually we find that we can learn the most from those. So I'm open to whoever would like to start.
I could start.
Great.
So this goes to our organizational evolution a little bit, but originally when we started supporting companies with philanthropic capital, we did that in a way, we didn't have a fund, right? We would identify a company that, we thought walked this balance of being needy but deserving is the term we use. So really compelling technology, team, et cetera, but a little too early, a little too risky to kind of meet the risk return profile that most investors needed at the time. And so we would basically take that company and go out to individual investors and just try to syndicate funds in, but didn't have any funds of our own. So in one case, a really compelling water filtration technology that could have a huge difference in energy efficiency. This company and its CEO are really an incredible pairing. In the end, we just saw that even though the CEO had done a great job sort of really compressing the plan and challenging fundraising environments and everything like that, there just wasn't ready capital coming in. And as we look in retrospect at this company, we say, well, wow, we really still believe in the technology and in the team, but there actually just wasn't enough money in. And for us, it was this caution against, kind of constraining companies too much and being overly reliant on kind of milestone-based investing, which we weren't doing that, but it kind of simulated the effects because we didn't have our own capital to really inject into the company. And so our learning from that in part was what launched us into fund mode, where we could invest directly and in larger amounts, so that when we saw an idea that was really compelling but really needed a more runway to get to retire certain milestones, that we actually had the flexibility to do that somewhat independently, rather than, be overly reliant on external partners.
So the failure was that you weren't able to move forward in that particular case, whereas now that you have the fund in place, you are able to, when you see a company that you believe in, but you don't have to necessarily convince individual investors to move.
That's right. That's right. And I think specifically for us, looking back, we see a pathway where more capital really could have made a difference for this company. Whereas that's not always the case in retrospect, right? You said, oh, I ran, a $2 million experiment. It failed. That's fine. We felt this actually didn't have a full shot based on the amount of capital that went in.
Yeah, you couldn't take the risk that you are set up to take, basically.
Exactly.
Great. Who would like to go next? I know people like to avoid talking about their failures.
I can hop in.
Great.
So less of a failure, I suppose, and more of a setback. We have been fortunate. We're quite early, so we've been fortunate that we haven't had any major failures in this space yet. Yet, of course, in this world, we always have to asterisk that. But so one of our companies provides ocean sensors to provide certainty in marine weather forecasting. It's one of our older investments in the space, and I think I'll be quick here because I think there's lots of setbacks and failures along the way. But I think what we realized and what set us back here was, one, you can't spell hardware without the word hard, and everyone knows that. So hardware is hard, which isn't to say it's impossible. And if anything, in my opinion, it again begets more impact and more opportunity. So that's probably one big learning we learned. The sales cycles were mistimed. We were too early, and market timing is everything. They're just starting. And the reason I don't categorize it as a failure is because they're still very active and actually finding product market fit finally, which is fantastic. But we were too early, and we're lucky it didn't kind of kill us in the beginning. But they plugged through. And then I think last learning, which is actually kind of an exciting one to me that came out of this setback or long, tough journey with the company, was how underserved the category of ocean technology is. So that is the more exciting one, in my opinion, and what we learn out of a lot of our investments. What comes out, the learnings are incredibly fortunate, and so kind of how underserved the category is actually pretty exciting to me. But that probably came out of a lot of the setbacks, that learning.
So would that be an example of something that others are not necessarily running away, but not even knowing there's there, that you're now leaning into?
Yeah, that's definitely one of the spaces. I think it's a massive category. Obviously, our ocean, we have to spend a lot more capital here, and a lot more time. And there's a lot of people, brilliant people building in this space. But it's been one of probably the more underserved within the venture capital space, at least.
Mm-hmm. Great. Jake, how about we go to you next?
Yeah, well, if we're talking about setbacks, I'll just say the massive disappointment today due to the weather as investors in SpaceX, that there isn't a pair of astronauts going towards the space station right now, which I imagine probably some folks at least had maybe the live stream going next to this, so maybe we have some more attention. But I'll kind of maybe keep on the point of, I guess, setback and less of a failure, particularly, given my time with the fund and, where we are sort of in our life cycle of also investing pretty early stage. And maybe you can speak to a challenge, with one of our portfolio companies early on. And I think it's kind of helpful to have a specific case study. And it's very similar to Priscilla's point of kind of, being in an underserved area, but it's this idea of where maybe climate tech deviates a little bit from clean tech 1.0. And one of the set of challenges that I think we face as investors is when you're entering into these newer unknown sectors that are maybe both foreign to traditional venture funds, definitely, as well as even, sort of clean tech funds. And so an example of this is we have a company in our portfolio called Better Place Forests. And the company is a mashup of two industries that I would suspect most people on this call don't often think about, which are conservation and death care, or you can think about as we like to call it eternity care. And so really quickly, the business model of this company is they invest in forests around the country, which are at risk of deforestation. And they purchase that land and set up a permanent conservation easement on it so that it will not be logged or removed. And what they do is they sell individual trees to families who might have a loved one that passed away, where they can spread the ashes after cremation. And it's essentially, this idea of being able to still have that final resting place that we've come to associate with graveyards, but in a, much more beautiful, and they have these gorgeous redwood forests in Point Reyes, California, and Santa Barbara, and have a living memoriam that also, works to combat climate change. And I think we all know kind of around the table that deforestation counts for about 1/5 of global emissions, and trees are this incredible carbon sequestration technology. The challenge is when you invest early in a company like this, there is a lot of skepticism. I mean, the idea of death care and conservation being put together, and when you kind of talk about new models, no one besides, really nonprofits have been monetizing conservation. And so when this company went out to raise its seed round, DBL, we essentially did the whole round because there weren't a lot of funds that I think were keyed into this opportunity. And one of the challenges is, as you look to kind of have capital formation over time, you really need to kind of develop the story, normalize it within the venture community, build a robust economic model behind the company. In this example where, I think a fund like DBL that was kind of clued in on the climate coming in early on, and the initial, investment predated my time, when the company was able to go out and do their Series A, we were able to get one of the venerable venture funds of the Bay Area, which was Priscilla's team over at True, and, have since, kind of worked together to grow this company. But I think it very much speaks to her point of what is it like to invest in one of these nascent or unknown sectors, not even, a specific technology.
So yeah, trying to, you're basically like creating, I don't know if it's necessarily an asset class, but at least a new sector. That's for certain, yeah. And Connor, you must be familiar with having to create asset classes out of thin air.
So yeah, I won't speak to a particular failure, in part because as the federal government, our role is to work and invest and do the research that does have a high risk of failure. So it happens a lot. I talk about when I left RPE, I'm not sure what the numbers are right now, but 2 years ago when I left RPE, we'd roughly done in the 10 years of RPE, done 700-ish projects. Of those 700 projects, probably 100 were actually worth talking about and kind of went somewhere that it was, and probably half of those resulted in what I would call something successful. And even a smaller percentage ever became a company or anything. But that's where RPE is supposed to be, the Advanced Research Project, fail fast and all that fun stuff. And the department's supposed to do that as well. But what I would say is where we continue to try to be better and work harder at the department is we're content rich, to put it in the words of Undersecretary of Science DeBar. We've got a lot of things going on. Like I said, $18 billion worth of work. Our two biggest issues is one, a lot of people don't know what the Department of Energy does, which we're misnamed. We're really the Department of Nuclear Weapons Security and Science and Research, and doing the basic science and research for the federal government intramurally with our 17 national labs. But one of the biggest areas is I think that as a federal entity, the Department of Energy is still slow to evolve into what was the 1950s, 60s, go work at a national lab or go work at GM for your entire career, and that's where you're going to be, to really where we are today with the generation that is excited about new energy technologies and new research, and having a way and a capability for them to be part of the Department of Energy, but still be successful in going out and doing their own thing, and being an innovator and being an entrepreneur. And then they're the brightest minds in the country. We want them to be able to come back and work with the federal government again. And so developing policies that can catch up to that lag that I think we're experiencing right now, and is one of the inhibitors. And it goes a lot to personality, and it goes a lot to the people that go work at our national labs. But we run a program at the Department of Energy called Energy I-Core, which teaches our researchers to be more entrepreneurial-like, and it is a resounding success. I wish we could fund 10 times as many every year as we do, but it's a very successful program, and people get very excited about it, and it's infectious throughout the national labs and some of these bright minds that are going to develop this next set. And I'd say one more thing, which is those researchers aren't always the best people to go out and lead these companies and don't have the business acumen to go do this. And so finding different mechanisms, we have an OTT, we have the Commercialization Executive Program, which works on that. We've tried entrepreneurships in residence. There's a whole number of different programs that we've tried across the facilities. But finding best practices and ways to connect those are also something that we are eager to get better at.
That's great. Yeah, staying on you for a moment, Connor, I saw on your LinkedIn that there was I don't know if it was a call for proposals, so to speak, but you were wanting to fund innovators, especially during this time. And so trying to push more money out during this time. Speak a little bit more about that. Where's that money coming from, and how I would imagine if they know about it, innovators would be super excited. I'm certain money is scarce these days.
Sure, and we do think, to your point, and this goes back to my first comment about the COVID crisis that we're in right now, we do not think that money that has been allocated by Congress to us is best suited sitting in the coffers of the Treasury right now. It's best suited getting out the door and doing the things that we can to support the ecosystem. And so at the budget cycle that just finished, Congress gave us a substantial amount of money to feed into those innovation ecosystems. And we hope very soon to be putting out a funding opportunity that will attack that. And we look towards, we have NYSERD and Richard on the line, and we look towards those organizations that are going to help us turn $1 federal dollar into $2, $3, $4, $5 when we partner with local and state governments, because we definitely believe that's a great way, to Richard's point, to make sure that we're fully exploiting technologies, is to work with those local and state governments that are often more nimble than the federal government. So I would suggest that everybody continue to look at Office of Technology Transition's website for that funding opportunity that hopefully will come imminently. And I'd also put a plug in for another federal program that we have called labpartneringservice.org, labpartnering.org. And that is a website that we have set up to partner the innovation and the entrepreneurs and investors of the country with our lab technology, our research, our facilities, which are often underutilized by the small business community, supercomputers, light sources, and those amazing things that can really give you the leg up in international competition. And our researchers themselves, which you can connect to, tag, ask a question. These are U.S. taxpayer funded entities and things that we want to make sure are fully accessible to the ecosystem and community.
Great, excellent. Ben, what's the questions like coming in from the Q&A?
Yeah, we're getting some questions starting to trickle in from the Q&A. But if those of you in the audience, please feel free to submit more, because we do have a chance to address some of those questions. One I've seen come up in a couple different forms is about the role of institutional investors and endowments. And that's obviously something that comes up a lot for universities like Yale and Stanford, but there's a lot of money out there that's sitting with those investors. What's their role in funding nascent climate technologies?
Joanne, I'm going to call on you just because I think you probably have a model that's sort of best suited for that in some ways.
Specifically for the early stage, or Ben, can you clarify?
So we've seen it come through in a couple ways, but the question as posed is pretty general. Are these investors putting money in it at any point in the pipeline and phases of technology development? And is this something that they're interested in? And if not, why not?
Got it. I'm trying to look for the question here. Is this the CO2 related?
I moved one of them to the dismiss just to clean things up a little bit. But we've had it come through. One came through by email in advance. We have one: how much pension investment is going to nascent climate technologies? How much endowment investment?
So there have been some reports looking at this. The report that Ben cited right at the front of our program is the one that I know best, and has relatively recent data, maybe from 27 up to 2017. So, It's the kind of thing that could be refreshed, but I'm guessing it hasn't changed that much. And what that report shows, and it's available on the Prime website and elsewhere, but feel free to go there to download. What that report shows is, I don't remember the percentages offhand, but just extremely little capital going into solutions like these from pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, and foundation endowments. Of course, it's all in how you slice it. So it's not to say that there are no allocations related to climate tech. It's all a matter of how you slice it. The type of work that we do at Prime, very focused on hard technologies and early stage. That's going to be pretty much out of scope for any of these institutional investors, even if they do have an allocation in climate tech. But more likely they don't parse it that way. So more likely they have an allocation in venture capital. And some of that allocation in venture capital may in fact be sustainability oriented. In the past, when we've tried to really parse out how much of that is going to nascent, early stage, hard tech, we've struggled to do so, and that report is our best shot at it. Now, there are foundation endowments, of course, that are moving into more fully aligned investing. And what that means is just that they're giving their trustees who have fiduciary responsibility to manage the foundation endowments, they're giving those trustees a mandate to invest that capital prudently, to regenerate the wealth, but in a way that also advances the climate mission. And this is a lot of what the impact investing world is about, is helping those foundation endowments and other institutional investors as well start to think about how to align long-term investing to advance their mission. But it's still quite early stage, and I would say that the numbers haven't shifted a lot. There are some good examples: MacArthur Foundation, the Heron Foundation, Packard Foundation. There are great examples of foundation endowments in particular starting to move in this direction. But if you look at the macro numbers, it hasn't yet changed very much.
Yeah. And I'll toss one more quick thing in there, and totally agree with you, Joanna. Just from a personal perspective, what we've noticed with this, we're going through a fundraise, Fund 7 for us. And one interesting thing to note, on a related note, is that this fundraise had more questions about ESG and climate tech from endowments and pension funds that are potential LPs of ours than any previous we've ever had. So just an interesting observation on our end.
How about DBL, Jake? What's your experience there?
Yeah. So, I mean, DBL has been part of the divest, reinvest on the reinvest, component for a long time. And sort of where DBL is situated in this impact investing spectrum is, been kind of one of the pioneers of a fund that believes, and we do deeply believe this, that you can have great financial returns alongside impact. And so I think it takes a lot of models like that to prove it out. And if anything, kind of as you look at the current coronavirus pandemic, first, impact investing has, just skyrocketed over the last decade. It's up about 10x. The numbers are $52 billion in asset under management 10 years ago, over $500 billion now. And I was going to say, as you look at the current pandemic, one of the things it's done is shown a light towards a lot of these sectors that had a lot of vulnerability and fragility, and that there's opportunity for going forward. So to give a very specific example, which I'm happy to be able to speak about because the news came out yesterday, is we have a portfolio company, Appeal Sciences, that helps with the problem of food waste. And what their technology is, this plant-based polymer that can go on the outside of fruits and vegetables and extend the shelf life 2 to 3x. And they just raised $250 million right at the height of COVID, when a lot of funding was shut down. And the headline was that Oprah Winfrey and Katy Perry invested, but they were not the majority of the $250 million, although maybe Oprah could foot that bill. A lot of it came from GIC, which is an investment arm of the Singapore pension fund. So, there are these fantastic opportunities when you talk about climate, especially in some of these adjacent sectors too, beyond just, clean energy and clean tech. But I think there is a ton of interest. Jigger's fund Generate, having $1 billion AUM, their fundraise is a great shining example. There is interest and hopefully we'll see more endowments and other institutional funds continue to move this way.
And how much is that also just because of sort of we're hearing so much about food spoiling, and so like this being a new market opportunity, in a sense, to like extend the life of food that is going to waste.
Yeah, so if people don't know this, about 40% of all of our food goes to waste, is the number, which if you think about it from a climate perspective, that is an incredible amount of carbon intensity to go into growing food, to transporting it. There are, different stages where the food does go to waste, but to have that go directly into the atmosphere. And so that is a huge component of it. The other part of it too is as you look at what's happened with, supply chain resiliency, and, food has been a very stark example of this that I think most of us have, felt in a very tangible way. The ability for, distributors to ship to a market that might be further away in a different geography because you're reducing spoilage, for all of those elements of, variability and uncertainty that a grocer might have to have when they're stocking or making a purchasing decision. Really, this is a sector that has not been modernized for close to 100 years. And it, is a technology solution, and these type of companies, and it's not, just appeal. Imperfect Produce is another example. They're a company not in our portfolio, but they just raised $72 million last week. It has, become very, very important, I think, and is, probably an innovation cycle that existed before COVID, but has been pulled forward and really shined a light on because of the current crisis.
Are there others that want to jump in on opportunities that they're seeing during this time that they have become more of an opportunity?
Well, maybe a couple thoughts to thread together. We do have some bright spots in our portfolio, which is great. Despite the challenging environment, one of our companies, Via Separations, spin out from MIT. They're a novel membrane for industrial separations. One of their first markets is pulp and paper, and what is one industry that has growing demand right now is pulp and paper. And so I think that's actually it could be an indicator for some other industrial process trends where the margins are, everyone's looking for any singular advantage they can have, including, in efficiency plays. And in this case, it's pulp and paper, but we're also looking very closely at other industrial processes. We've recently invested in a low carbon cement play. We're also very interested in steel making and so on. These production facilities are not going away. Some of them are ramping up, and getting squeezed at the competition. So startups that can present new solutions could be more compelling in this time than in normal times.
So I know you were talking about supply chains. What anything interesting on supply chains in your portfolio as a result of what's happening?
Yes, obviously, given the crisis, it's a topic of interest for all of us. I think Jake touched a bit on supply chain. So we've focused a lot on the food supply chain, the meat market. It is absolutely depressing, the amount of pigs being slaughtered and euthanized because they can't keep up with the demand, and the amount of meat plants shutting down is frightening. So I think there is massive opportunity in that space. To touch on a different one, I think materials is also an interesting space, and one that I think also scares some traditional investors off. It's a massive market. When you break it out, there's tons of subsectors, and so it gets a little complicated, but cement is super interesting. It accounts for 8% of carbon emissions. So there's tons within that. Alternative packaging is one that I've been thinking quite a bit about, given when I walked into a Safeway recently and they forced me to walk out with plastic bags for the first time in 10 years, I can remember doing that. It was quite depressing. And so that's a space that I'm really, really intrigued by because of the kind of backwards traction that we've seen recently. I think there is, but on top of that, the amount of brilliant people building in this space, and what we can do to stop that part of the crisis. So lots to be done, and a lot of spaces of interest.
And Connor, I want to make some space for you if there was something in particular you're seeing on the horizon that this time is.
I think as we go forward, in particular on supply chains, I think we'll see a bigger push by federal and state governments to look more into onshore manufacturing and production. And with the new and sophisticated technologies that we have, particularly that can go into large scale buildings and things like that, I think right now, as we all know, we're about to, at some point here, eventually build our infrastructure for the next 50 to 100 years, as our old infrastructure is coming up on 70 to 80 years old here. And how we put these technologies that we all kind of discuss all the time into that new infrastructure discussion is going to be very, very important, and needs to be at the forefront, especially as, like I said, I think a lot of the production that we've seen leave, and frankly, some of it is very high in carbon output. What does that look like when it comes back into a different discussion here in the United States?
Mm-hmm. Ben, what else is coming up on the Q&A from attendees?
Yeah, well, when we took those first couple questions, we definitely opened up the floodgates. So thank you all for your enthusiastic questions. I think that question you asked, Namrita, about new horizons, it covered some of it. I think multiple people, talked about what about geothermal, what about carbon removal and sequestration through natural and removed means, and advanced nuclear. So there's a number of kind of technologies people were asking about specifically that were coming up. But we also got some questions kind of more generally across those different areas about how investors like yourselves can, working with this wide set of climate technologies, can develop specific strategies. And so kind of around what are the strategies that you use to help the startups move into commercialization, whether it's government support, flexible funding structures, partnerships with one another. So I think I want to kind of consolidate those questions with kind of what have you found to be kind of the most effective at working with this range of technologies?
Jake, I'm going to call on you, since I think you seem to be kind of the missing link sometimes across a lot of different sectors and investment silos.
Yeah. So, I mean, one of the sort of interesting positions that, and this really is, DBL as a fund for a long time has been kind of playing in, I'd say, a number of different buckets as it relates to sustainability. And I think one thing, particularly sitting out here in the Bay Area, that's missing in venture a lot is engagement with policy. And so it's something where we as a fund, and I have, a colleague, Lisa Hagerman, who's our director of programs, that does a number of things as it relates to the impact side of portfolio management for us. But one of those key pillars is policy and engaging with policymakers. And it is definitely a two-way street where, I think something that probably we as an investment committee undervalue is, being a constituency that can speak with government and give, insight into innovation. As well as collaboration, right? And, groups like the national labs, and, what Connor's focusing on. I think there's also, a set of kind of policy questions that, we look at supporting, our portfolio companies with, whether it be, sort of early days of looking at, carbon tax credits to, there's a whole set of policy initiatives that we're working on right now with our portfolio company, Farmers Business Network, around low carbon agriculture, and whether or not you can actually incentivize farmers to do things like low till, no till practice on these, large scale cover crops that could have a really meaningful impact on our carbon emissions, as well as, nitrates and looking at phosphate based fertilizers. So I say that's a group that is, probably something we'd like to see built up even more within the venture ecosystem in terms of collaboration.
Priscilla?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, Jake just mentioned collaboration, and it's come up quite a bit, and it is a big feature in the report that Ben put in the chat. And it's really important in our world. I mean, our world is collaboration, and it hasn't always been that way, but it's one of my favorite parts about being an investor is a collaboration between various investors in various stages. And so I think that in terms of supporting our portfolio companies in this space, the best thing that I as an investor can do, and we as a firm can do, is know our founder really, really well, and know the company, know the space really well, so we know who to set them up for. So Jake was crazy enough to bring us into Better Place Forest. he had to know that we're the crazy ones that would ever even think about being in the desk care space. So talk about collaboration there. That's incredibly important. For our later stage companies, it's been really important to know when to bring corporate and strategic investors in. We have had various levels of success and failure with that, especially in the early stage. So it's been, a learning process on our end to kind of bring them in at the right stage for our companies. But it's also been incredibly helpful in this space. Corporate and strategic investors, especially in the food and innovative food space, with some of our companies in that sector, has been kind of a game changer for them, both in terms of funding and in terms of either filling a board seat and bringing in a different perspective, or just bringing in an absolutely, different network than we ever could have. So that's been really important for us.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And Joanna, Prime's model is really based on collaboration. Talk more about what are some of the unexpected stakeholders that you've been collaborating with?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we find that our investor base is our LPs, that is just a very passionate group of people with incredible talents. And so we have seen many wonderful collaborations result between our LPs and portfolio companies. To give one example, the ClearPath Foundation in DC does a lot of great policy and regulatory work and has gotten very involved in helping some of our companies think about navigating policy risk and developing a strategy for deployment where there could be regulatory barriers. I would also just underline, what Priscilla said in terms of corporate and strategic involvement. That's been important for us. Although for the companies that we work with, not always as investors. Oftentimes we will be working with companies that are just developing their first product, and it can be very meaningful for them, both in terms of optics, but also just learning to do early partnership projects, joint development, or NRE projects with a corporate partner. And so we're often, helping identify those first corporate partners. And typically this type of engagement would happen before a corporate would be ready to invest. And it can be a good way to lay the groundwork for an eventual corporate investment. It doesn't need to be that. It can be just an early customer relationship. And then another place where we work with early stage founders is on board development as well. So helping them identify independent board members especially, but in general, just creating a board that is really appropriate for them to grow into their next stage, which may look a lot different than, the board that consists of, a founder upon, finishing their PhD and their PhD advisor. So that's another area where we lean hard on our network.
Excellent. And Connor, how about you? I would imagine you can't do anything pretty much without collaboration to some extent.
Well, networks are huge. And the biggest, one of the biggest things that we took on as a challenge in OTT whenever I started was breaking down everything into policy, access, and promotion. And the promotion part is forward leaning, doing the external affairs work. We have a whole series called our Innovation X Lab series, which hopes to bring technology that is being worked on across the department with the investor community. The Department of Energy does great with bringing scientists together and talking about how molecules bounce off each other. They don't do really well at bringing in outside sources and non-research community and investor community entrepreneurs to talk about how it can actually be applicable science and research. And so increasing that, but also making those connections more purposeful, less accidental, from the largest companies in the country to small investment firms and everything in between. We continually hear, we used to do work with DOE 20 years ago, but then Jim retired and we didn't know who to call anymore. So, the thing that there's to the entire community is that Office of Technology Transitions, we want to be the front door to the department. We'll match you up. We're not the end spot for you. We'll match you with the right lab, program office, or place that can help you, and vice versa, to where you can help us move some of these great ideas out into the community so that they actually do make an impact in the long term.
Great. Well, unfortunately, our time is now running short. I'm going to just do a couple wrap-up points and then hand it back to you, Ben, to bring us home. Fascinating discussion. Everything from sort of hearing about in the beginning about the importance of not just innovation, but also deployment and working across silos, and then hearing these really tremendous examples of how all of you are working across silos in a very robust way. And it sounds like we just need more of that, but that there is a lot of opportunity. I'm coming out of this conversation feeling very, very encouraged and thinking about how do I bring more of people across the spectrum into the conversation and connect them up in more of a robust way to kind of get us where we want to go here. So let me hand that back to you, Ben, for our final wrap up.
Yes, thank you, Namrita. A big thank you to our opening speakers, Richard and Jigger, and they've been able to listen in on some of this conversation over the last hour or so as well. Another thank you to all of our panelists for that really engaging discussion on financing early stage climate technologies and kind of the different phases that each of them represent and the different set of investments and the collaborations among them. So that was really exciting to hear about. As we wrap up here and close out this event, I'm going to share in the chat that CBAE report that I mentioned that talks about some of the things we've mentioned here today in terms of some specific considerations for investors looking to get in on nascent climate technologies, some of the things they might consider. I also want to share that report that that Johanna mentioned, because that's a great report that inspired and kind of was the foundation for what that CBAE report went on to say. And then the last thing that I want to share with everyone is a link to a Zoom meeting. We had so much interest in this event. It was incredible to see, great enthusiasm. And we saw all this interest from such a diverse set of folks that we thought, why don't we get some of these folks together? And I saw in the Q&A and the chat function, a lot of you had things that you wanted to share and talk about. So feel free to join this Zoom meeting and we'll have a chance for some networking and some smaller breakout groups if you want to chat with some of the folks who've been on this today. We were pinging for most of this webinar between about 300 and 400 participants. So just really exciting level of participation and engagement. Please stay in touch with all of the sponsors of the event, including CBAE, for more conversations on this subject of climate technologies. Thank you all so much for being here. Stay well, stay safe, and take care.